Buenos días a todos. Gracias por acompañarnos en esta que es la segunda jornada del ciclo de conferencias sobre litigio societario. Yo soy Sergio Londoño, asociado de D.L.A. Piper y profesor de conflictos societarios en la Universidad de los Andes, y moderaré la sesión de hoy. Tengo el gusto, para comenzar, de presentarles al doctor Camilo Martínez, socio director de D.L.A. Piper Martínez Beltrán, quien introducirá la jornada de hoy, así que le doy el uso de la palabra en este momento a Camilo. Bienvenido.
Muchas gracias, Sergio. Muy buenos días y bienvenidos a la segunda jornada del ciclo de conferencias sobre litigios societarios. Estos foros, organizados por D.L.A. Piper, el Centro de Estudios de Derecho Procesal y el Instituto de Análisis Societario, buscan promover discusiones entre académicos y practicantes en torno al impacto económico de diferentes instituciones procesales y de litigio en la resolución de conflictos societarios. Hace una semana contamos con la presencia de distinguidos académicos, expertos en derecho de sociedades. El profesor Luca Enríquez dictó una charla inaugural sobre los rasgos y la importancia de los jueces especializados en materia de sociedades, al paso que los profesores Amir Licht y Larry Amermech ahondaron en las dinámicas de litigio societario en Israel y Delaware, dos jurisdicciones que, como Colombia, cuentan con foros especializados en derecho de sociedades. La conferencia de hoy buscará complementar esa visión académica con las experiencias prácticas de litigantes expertos en conflictos societarios, quienes ejercen ante las cortes especializadas de Países Bajos, Tel Aviv y Delaware. Michiel Conrads, socio de la oficina de D.L.A. Piper en Ámsterdam, abrirá la sesión para ilustrarnos con su experiencia práctica como litigante ante la Corte Empresarial de Holanda. Luego, Rotem Gilad, socia de resolución de disputas en la firma Meitar en Israel, presentará una visión práctica del litigio ante las Cortes Económicas de Tel Aviv y Haifa. Para cerrar, John Reed y Ronald Brown, tercero, socios de la oficina de D.L.A. Piper en Delaware, hablarán sobre sus experiencias en esta jurisdicción reconocida por uno de nuestros conferencistas anteriores como la Meca en el litigio societario. Nada menos en Delaware se aprobó hace cerca de un mes una nueva reforma al régimen societario con el objetivo de atender desde el derecho empresarial los retos derivados de la pandemia. Como es bien sabido, en esa jurisdicción existe un compromiso permanente por renovar las reglas en materia de sociedades de manera constante, atendiendo las necesidades de los empresarios. Este ciclo de conferencias justamente pretende generar espacios de necesaria discusión entre la academia y la práctica, tanto local como extranjera, con miras a evaluar posibles reformas al régimen de litigio societario en Colombia. Es por eso que en la tercera y última sesión del próximo 26 de agosto tendrá lugar una jornada en la que un grupo de practicantes y profesores colombianos presentará algunas ideas para una reforma en este sentido. Sin duda, esas ideas se nutrirán de las experiencias que hoy traerán a la mesa los litigantes expertos de Holanda, Israel y Delaware. Voy a hacer ahora unas breves anotaciones antes de darle la palabra a nuestros ilustres invitados. La historia del derecho societario en Colombia puede dividirse en tres momentos históricos. El primero de ellos, a partir de la expedición del Código de Comercio, que va hasta el año 1995 con la expedición de la Ley 222. Este periodo se caracteriza por dos razones principales. Primero, porque los deberes de los administradores en esa etapa estaban circunscritos a aquellos propios de los mandatarios, dado que no existían en el ordenamiento jurídico colombiano deberes especiales para los administradores. De manera que los administradores solamente respondían en el caso en que quebrantaran los deberes del mandatario derivados del contrato de mandato. La segunda característica de ese periodo consiste en la baja actividad litigiosa en materia societaria, Es más, se pueden contar casi que con los dedos de la mano los litigios societarios que se llevaron a cabo antes del año 1995. El segundo momento histórico inicia precisamente en el año 95 con la expedición de la Ley 222 y abarca hasta la creación de la delegatura para procedimientos mercantiles, nuestra Corte en materia de litigio societario. Esta etapa es fundamental en el desarrollo del litigio societario, dado que la Ley 222 introdujo a nuestro ordenamiento jurídico los deberes de los administradores de las sociedades, según lo dispuso el artículo 23. No obstante, esta etapa también se caracteriza por una baja actividad litigiosa en materia societaria, que aunque superior a la actividad de la primera etapa, no alcanzó su potencial dado que no existía el escenario propio para ventilar y resolver los conflictos societarios. La tercera etapa inicia desde la creación de nuestra Corte en materia societaria, la delegatura para procedimientos mercantiles, y va hasta nuestros días. Esta etapa se caracteriza por una mayor actividad litigiosa a pesar de que el ordenamiento jurídico que regula el contrato social no fue modificado. Se trata entonces de la creación de un escenario técnico y especializado para resolver conflictos en materia societaria. Esto ha permitido, sin duda alguna, profundizar en diferentes conceptos societarios que han dado cabida a que se formulen cada vez más litigios. Y se puede identificar que la evolución ha sido prácticamente en dos frentes en esta tercera etapa. El abuso del derecho del accionista. Principalmente se ha profundizado en el abuso del accionista mayoritario frente al accionista minoritario, concepto jurídico que era casi inexistente en las dos primeras etapas de la historia del derecho societario y del litigio societario antes mencionadas. Y segundo, en materia de conflictos de interés en cabeza de los administradores, particularmente de los miembros de junta directiva. Concepto este último que también era prácticamente inexistente en las dos primeras etapas en materia litigiosa societaria. De manera que nuestra Corte especializada en conflicto societario ha promovido el litigio societario a efectos de que los diferentes actores del contrato social tengan un escenario apropiado para resolver sus conflictos y hacer respetar sus derechos. Desde un punto de vista práctico del litigio societario, es fundamental que avancemos en el desarrollo legislativo de ciertos conceptos societarios, porque no hay seguridad jurídica mientras, por ejemplo, no tengamos una definición de conflicto de interés dentro de nuestro ordenamiento jurídico positivo. Y la seguridad jurídica es el pilar fundamental del derecho societario y en general del derecho. Por esa razón es necesaria que desde el punto de vista legislativo avancemos en una reforma que recoja el desarrollo jurisprudencial que ha tenido la delegatura a efectos de que podamos tener dentro de nuestro ordenamiento positivo conceptos como el de la definición del conflicto de interés, del abuso del derecho, de manera tal que los actores del derecho societario, los empresarios, tengan una clara definición y puedan comportarse de manera dentro del ordenamiento jurídico. Con esto termino mi introducción y tengo entonces el privilegio de presentarles a Michael Conrads, socio de DLA Piper Amsterdam, donde dirige la práctica de litigios. Su práctica se enfoca en litigio societario del mercado de capitales, con especial énfasis en responsabilidad de administradores, acciones de clase y controversias complejas relacionadas a operaciones de fusiones y adquisiciones. Michael ha adelantado estudios en la Universidad de Groningen y el INSEAD. Hace parte de la Asociación Holandesa de Litigio Societario. Tanto él como su práctica de litigio en Ámsterdam han sido reconocidas por Legal 500. En su conferencia, el doctor Conrads nos hablará acerca de su experiencia como litigante ante la Corte Especializada en Derecho Societario de Holanda. Welcome, Michael. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we should be visible right now. Thank you very much for having us. It's a great honor to feature on your webinar, and it's this it's great to be as partners in this global firm to speak to the audience in South America. I'm here together with my friend Tom Houvast. Tom, perhaps you can introduce yourself for a minute.
Yeah, thank you, Michiel. I am an associate in the DLA Piper corporate litigation department. I work with Michiel on a lot of corporate law issues, and I also often litigate in front of the enterprise chamber that we will talk with you about.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. So we have a couple of slides that we prepared, and we are going to try to get them on the screen for the audience. Let's see if that works. If it doesn't, then I'm sure that Camilla can make these available for everybody.
Yeah, these are the slides.
Yeah, there we have the slides. Fantastic. Let's flip back one or two. Yeah. So we're taking the next 20 minutes or so to guide you through the slides about the Dutch Enterprise Chamber, and we want to give the floor for Q&As. So if anybody has any questions, we're more than happy to take them. I'm also very pleased that John Reed from Delaware is on the webinar as well, because this whole thing, the Dutch Enterprise Chamber, is actually inspired by the Delaware Chancery Court. And John will be very pleased to hear that the Dutch took a close look at how our friends in the US designed this type of corporate governance courts. The Dutch Enterprise Chamber is actually 45 years old this year. It was established in 1975. So we have a couple of decades of experience in litigating shareholder disputes, and actually the Dutch Company Court or Enterprise Chamber has been a great source of case law in the Netherlands, which found its way into statutory law and the Dutch Corporate Governance Code. So when these guys started in 1975, it was kind of a pioneering effort because there were not that much rules around corporate governance. We were inspired to a certain extent by what our friends in the US had established, but to translate that to a more continental European perspective was quite an exercise, because the corporate law systems in Europe are to a certain extent different from the corporate law system in the US and the United Kingdom. And I think the key difference is that the Dutch and the rest of continental Europe applies the stakeholder system as opposed to the shareholder system. In the shareholder system, the shareholders in the company, as the owners of the company, are viewed as being the boss and calling the shots. In the European system, it is slightly different, and it is more of a balancing exercise of all the interests of all stakeholders involved. And stakeholders are shareholders, debt providers, other creditors, trade partners, and employees, and all those interests should align, but sometimes they don't align, and there is a collision between those interests. And it is the task of the company's board to find its way in this minefield. And that's exactly what the company court is for. It oversees the balancing exercise by the board. And if there is a stakeholder who feels disgruntled because they feel that their interests are not properly fed into the company strategy, they can go to the Enterprise Chamber and ask for an injunction. And the Enterprise Chamber has pretty far-reaching powers to intervene in the company or the corporate governance of a company. And Tom will guide you through that in a minute. But I think the key takeaway here, if there is anything I'd like you to remember after this session, is that the Dutch Company Court is practical, it's fast, and it has a great impact. And fast, I mean that you can have an injunction in place within a matter of weeks. So that's one takeaway. The other takeaway is that it specializes in corporate law disputes and adheres only corporate law disputes. And if there is another dispute involving the company, you should go to the ordinary court. So it only hears corporate governance issues. And for that end, there are specialized judges who are absolutely experts in the corporate law field. And sometimes they're also professors. And the interesting thing is that, and that's a unique feature also for the Dutch legal system, where apart from the 3 judges in the panel, there are also 2 judges who are not legal professionals, but they are registered accountants, for instance, or corporate finance specialists. And they can provide their valuable input in the decision-making process by the court, because very often this has a corporate finance aspect to it, of course. So what does it actually do? It is the competent court to hear corporate governance disputes, the inquiry proceedings, they're called, and Tom will explain in a minute what it actually is. Statutory buyout proceedings, meaning that if you have a minority shareholder below a certain threshold, you can push him out as a majority shareholder, but it needs to go through court, of course, and that's what the Enterprise Chamber is also for. Furthermore, there is works council disputes, and that's where the employee interest group basically feeds in, and they have a say in the policy of and the strategy of the company, and they have access to the Enterprise Chamber if they feel that the employees' rights are mistreated. And very importantly, disputes around annual accounts. If a shareholder finds that the annual accounts don't represent the actual financial situation of the company. So, shall I give the floor to you, Tom?
Yeah, sure.
About the inquiry proceedings, a little bit, because that's the most important feature. The other elements you can just forget. Keep in mind that they exist, but the main show in the Enterprise Chamber is for the inquiry proceedings, and we allow us to become a little bit technical, not too technical. And in a minute we go into the war story, explain a few notable cases that have shaped the corporate law landscape in the Netherlands.
Yeah.
Tom.
Thanks, Michiel, for the introduction. As Michiel just shared with you, the inquiry proceedings is the forum in the Netherlands where good corporate governance is tested by a court, and this has been used for decades to shape the content of corporate governance in the Netherlands. And as a result of 45 years of case law, the current corporate governance code in the Netherlands contains a lot of principles that directly derive from the case law by the Enterprise Chamber in the inquiry proceedings, and also a lot of standards in public M&A, public offers have been developed by the Enterprise Chamber over the course of the past years, and I will take you through them with the war stories that Michiel just announced. Well, what do the inquiry proceedings entail? In the basis, if the case is declared eligible by the court, it entails an independent inquiry into the company's strategy and the state of affairs. But in practice, that is not really what the inquiry proceedings are about. They are a very popular instrument in corporate law because the enterprise chamber has very broad power and has also shown great willingness to take injunctive measures at an earlier stage before the actual inquiry has taken place. So and also taking in mind the willingness to act fast, you can get an injunction within a matter of weeks and even within days if the case is really urgent. This has become by far the most popular instrument in the Netherlands to test corporate governance within Dutch companies. The inquiry proceedings, they aim to enhance transparency regarding the strategy and the state of affairs within the company. So there you see what really the goal is of the inquiry. But it also is aimed at restoring relations between the different governing bodies. Often you see that different bodies within the company, such as the shareholders, perhaps there are minority shareholders, or the board of directors may have different interests or a different view on where to go with the company. And sometimes as a result of such a dispute, a deadlock can occur. And the enterprise chamber is looking for ways to break such a deadlock and restore the good relations between the several bodies within the company. And the final goal of the inquiry proceedings is to establish whether the company has been mismanaged. And mismanagement is not limited to acts by others, but it can relate also to acts by other corporate bodies, such as shareholders, perhaps a majority shareholder that is blocking any reasonable decision making within the company. That can also qualify as mismanagement. And after the establishment of mismanagement by the enterprise chamber, you often see that separate liability proceedings are commenced against the party that has been established to mismanage the company. I propose that we go on to the next slide, where we take you through some war stories, some landmark cases that truly have shaped the Dutch landscape of corporate governance.
Yeah.
Shall I kick off?
Yeah, please go ahead. And one thing to perhaps to note is, you know, there are only 4 cases here that we want to use as an example, but the company court is in session every week, and they hear 2 to 4 cases in each session. So there is quite a big caseload in the Netherlands. These are a couple of big cases that we're going to mention about listed companies that shape the corporate governance landscape. But that also works for smaller cases and family businesses or mid-size enterprises.
Yeah.
So Tom, go ahead. ABN AMRO is my favorite case, so go ahead.
Yeah, I believe you worked on it back in the days, right?
Yeah.
So ABN AMRO was at the time one of the largest banks in the world, actually, located in the Netherlands. And there were some hostile takeovers being prepared, in this case also by a consortium that consisted of the Royal Bank of Scotland, by the Belgian bank Fortis, and the Spanish bank Banco Santander. And in order to, let's say, frustrate this hostile takeover, they wanted to leave a poison pill by selling their crown jewel, a big American bank called LaSalle. And there were some shareholders that were really in favor of this takeover bid by the consortium and wanted this to go through. So they started proceedings with the enterprise chamber, saying that they should be heard in the general meeting of shareholders before LaSalle Bank could actually be sold to a third party. So I think within a matter of weeks, the enterprise chamber ruled that indeed shareholders' approval was required. Unfortunately, this was overturned by the Dutch Supreme Court also within a matter of weeks, saying that shareholder approval was not required, and that the company's board was entitled to execute this transaction without shareholder approval. And this truly shaped corporate governance in the Netherlands in a sense that it demarcated the powers of each of the governing bodies And this still is one of the cornerstones, I would say, of Dutch corporate governance.
Yeah. So what happened after that case is the enterprise chamber has ruled that the management board was allowed to put this poison pill in place, and that killed the takeover bid by Barclays. And a couple of months later, there was a competing bid by RBS, Santander, and Fortis, who took over ABN AMRO for 94 billion euros. It was, as Tom said, it was a very important decision because it was confirmed that the company's board is in the driver's seat and not the shareholders. And I think that's also one of the questions that came again to the court in a recent big case of Akzo Nobel. You may have heard of it. It's the big Dutch international chemicals company. And they were confronted by a shareholder bid by American computer PPG. Tom and I also worked on that case, which was litigated before the enterprise chamber. And perhaps, Tom, you can speak about that.
Yeah. Again, in this case, a hostile takeover bid was being prepared by an American competitor called PPG. And PPG approached Akzo Nobel to engage in discussions and try to enter into negotiations about a friendly takeover, but Akzo Nobel immediately closed the door and refused to talk to PPG, and basically ended all communications with PPG. Then PPG colluded actually with some of the minority shareholders in Akzo Nobel, trying to force Akzo Nobel to enter into negotiations. Akzo still denied. Then the shareholders sent a public letter to the company demanding the dismissal of the chairman of the supervisory board. So this was truly a pressure cooker within a couple of days, where this dispute was being fought through the media, in the offices of the directors, and also in court, because the shareholders initiated again inquiry proceedings demanding that Akzo Nobel engaged in negotiations with PPG, and also demanding the dismissal of the chairman of the supervisory board. But again, the enterprise chamber confirmed that the board of directors in principle is in the driver's seat, that it was not in any way obliged to enter into negotiations with this American party that wants to take over Akzo Nobel, and basically denied all the claims by shareholders.
Yeah. So those are cases that are litigated in a matter of days or weeks or so, and all interested parties and their counsel have speaking time before the court. So that would be the company's board, the company's supervisory board, the works counsel, the bidder and the competing bidder, and perhaps some, and of course shareholders, and that makes the hearing some kind of a marketplace of all the interests at stake. Usually, it gains pretty much media attention in the Netherlands. It quite often is the opening item on the primetime news. So it has not only it has impact on the corporate governance landscape in the Netherlands, but it also has the political and public attention. So we have two other war stories on this slide, and let's save them for a minute, in the interest of time. And if you have some time left at the end, we can discuss them. But let's just see how it goes. Tom, perhaps you can discuss on eligibility and who has access to it.
A short note on the technicalities, as you announced. Basically, only Dutch companies can be the subject of the inquiry proceedings. That seems like a limitation, but in practice, we see that a lot of international corporate structures are structured through the Netherlands. They either have a Dutch top holding company or another company down the line that is Dutch, where you could request for the inquiry proceedings. And to give you an overview, Shell, Unilever, Fiat, IKEA, Ferrari, they're all companies that are structured through the Netherlands. So these are all eligible for the inquiry proceedings. You need to be a stakeholder in the company to be able to request these inquiry proceedings. And in practice, that means that the company itself can request the proceedings, and that can be either done by the board of directors or the supervisory board. Shareholders can request the inquiry proceedings, and depending on the size, you would either need 1 or 10% of the shares in the company. Or what you see in practice is that sometimes the company gives the right to ask for an inquiry proceeding through an agreement to a third party. That can be the works council. It can also be a sort of a friendly foundation that is part of the company's protection measures against hostile takeovers. And well, basically it could be anyone. Then the inquiry proceedings consist of 2 phases. In the first phase, at the applicant's request, the enterprise chamber will assess whether there are valid reasons to doubt the company's strategy and the state of affairs. And any other party with an interest, meaning shareholders, and now they are not bound to the thresholds that I just named, they are invited to either support the application, but they can also resist the application. And then the court will schedule a hearing where it is decided whether an investigation will be ordered. That is the regular, let's say, sequence of events in the proceedings. But in practice, you often see that before this hearing is scheduled, a separate hearing is scheduled, where the enterprise chamber will decide on whether an injunction is required in this particular case. And that truly is the power of the inquiry proceedings. Let's discuss the injunctive relief measures. Michiel, perhaps you can elaborate a bit?
Sure, this definitely is the main show of the whole proceedings. And Ton spoke a bit about investigation and all that, which is a very nice feature and very helpful for all kinds of purposes. But the main show is injunctive relief measures, because as a shareholder or as a company's board, you want to make sure that the corporate governance dispute within the company doesn't harm the company's business. So that in practice, that means that if there is a deadlock in the shareholders meeting, or if there is a dispute between the management board and the supervisory board, that dispute doesn't contaminate the company's business, and that the dispute is resolved as quickly as possible. So that's what the whole thing is aimed at. So what you need to have for that is pretty far-reaching powers for the to intervene and to remove the culprits, or to appoint other people, or do anything that solves the dispute, or make sure that the dispute is handled in a way that is not harming the business or any of the stakeholder interests. So a couple of examples of the powers are right in front of you on the slide. For instance, the enterprise chamber may suspend members of the board, so remove them temporarily, or they can appoint new people on the board, also on a temporary basis. And that's something that we come across most often. That the court-appointed person is appointed on the board to oversee the state of affairs within the company. And quite often that court-appointed person has far-reaching powers. For instance, that he or she may take the decisions on certain key topics, or that they have a veto in respect of the key topics. Another example is the suspension of voting rights. So if there is a deadlock in the company shareholders meeting, which prevents a decision from being taken, then that approval right can be removed, or a voting right of a certain shareholder or a group of shareholders can be removed in order to make sure that the appropriate decision is taken. And something that we come across now in these economic difficult times is emergency financing. If there is a company in urgent liquidity difficulties and solvency difficulties that needs a capital injection by the shareholders, you don't want to have that that other shareholders vote against that because they fear to be diluted as a shareholder in a company, and therefore basically misuse their voting rights to block the injection of fresh capital by the other shareholder. So that's an area that you want to avoid, because it leads to the bankruptcy of a company, and that would be a loss of capital and a loss of jobs and a loss of business. And that's something that the Enterprise Chamber finds that should not be permitted by a shareholder that misuses his rights. So in that case, the blocking shareholder is stripped from his voting rights, and the willing shareholder can go ahead, inject capital, and dilute the other shareholders. So that is pretty far-reaching, right? Because you can, in theory, lose control over your company. That doesn't mean that the Enterprise Chamber will take those measures quite easily. No, you need to have a very good case and explain why there is no other option to resolve the dispute than by taking these measures. But they are far-reaching, and they lead to a conservation of jobs and investments. Another example, apart from the voting rights stripping, is the share stripping. You can have your shares removed from you and put in a special custodian who will hold the shares temporarily as long as it is necessary to not put the company in jeopardy by virtue of the dispute. So they all are temporarily by nature, but the effects are quite often irrevocable. For instance, the voting rights stripping leading to the dilution of shareholders is temporarily, but the dilution is permanent. And the court may even, by doing this, ignore statutory rules and ignore shareholders' agreements. So it can break through anything that the parties have agreed if it is in the interest of the company. And the idea is that no stakeholder in the company may have his personal interests prevail over the larger interests of all the other stakeholders combined. One other example, for instance, is in the Gucci case, where the Enterprise Chamber suspended all voting rights of shareholders. ABN AMRO, the case that Tom mentioned, in which the court approved the sale of LaSalle without shareholders' approval, thereby actually breaking through statutory requirements of shareholder approval. So that's what a shareholder can do and can achieve in the enterprise chamber. And that's the main show. There is a side show, and that's the investigation. Very briefly, before we move to Q&A, just 1 minute or so.
Yeah. Very briefly on the phase 2. As indicated, you don't often reach phase 2 because phase 1 is most of the times sufficient to rebalance all the interests within the company. But if phase 2 commences, then an independent investigation is launched into the company strategy and state of affairs. And based on the report that is drafted by the independent investigator, the enterprise chamber will establish whether the company has been mismanaged. And then again, it can take certain measures. And also, as discussed, the establishment of mismanagement is often used as a building block for civil liability proceedings. But I agree with you. Let's move on to the Q&A.
Okay.
Perhaps you can open up the line. Not sure how that works.
Camilo.
Yes, thank you very much.
Hand back to you.
Tom. Thank you so much for your very interesting remarks, Michiel, Tom. We've been receiving some questions from our viewers, so allow me to pass them on to you. I think I will begin with this one, with this threshold question that will inform the remainder of the Q&A. Someone asks if you would say that share ownership in Netherlands tends to be concentrated and controlling shareholders common, or rather dispersed, where controlling shareholders are rather uncommon.
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting question, and that's the subject of debate in the Netherlands. Is as for listed companies, of course, from a company's perspective, you'd rather have a couple of big shareholders that you can talk to and be close and make sure that they are aligned with the strategy. And it's from a company's perspective, it is difficult to have a dispersed shareholder base with retail investors that are in it for the short term. So from a corporate law perspective, there have been some initiatives trying to reward long-term shareholders by giving them more dividend, for instance, or giving them more voting rights in order to give them an incentive to be an active shareholder and a long-term shareholder, because from the company's perspective, it helps the company in its long-term goals of being profitable. If also your shareholder base is in it for the long run. Great question.
Thank you, Michiel. And I think we have time for one more question, and I will. This is a question we've received. You have mentioned that preliminary injunctions in the Netherlands can be tremendously far-reaching, and someone asks if, in your experience, these preliminary injunctions have had an impact on the parties' willingness to settle their disputes instead of going to trial.
Yeah, another great question. In our experience, it does have the effect that the company's board know that if they don't act in the interest of the company, and if they don't maintain great relationships with their shareholders and employees and banks and creditors, then they are at risk of being sued in the enterprise chamber. So it has this effect that people that stakeholder interest as opposed to personal interest are top of mind. That's one thing. Second thing is that, of course, everybody involved would like to settle this as opposed to litigating over it. And the mere fact that there is an alternative to negotiated agreements, abadna in negotiation terms, the mere existing of abadna helps the negotiation process. So it actually enhances the out-of-court discussion among shareholders.
Fascinating, Michiel. Tom, thank you again for joining us. It has been a privilege to have you with us, and I hope you have a good remainder of the day. I will pass on the floor to Rotem Gilad. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, it was a pleasure.
Gracias, Michiel. Tom, ahora tengo el privilegio de presentar a Rotem Gilad, quien ya está con nosotros. Rotem es socia del área de litigios de la firma Meitar en Tel Aviv, una de las firmas más reconocidas en Israel en materia de resolución de controversias. Su práctica se enfoca particularmente en acciones derivadas y acciones de clase en materia societaria y de mercado de capitales. Rotem ha participado en litigios de alto impacto, referentes, entre otros temas, a tomas hostiles de control, a responsabilidad de administradores, a conflictos en general entre accionistas controlantes y minoritarios. Antes de vincularse a Meitar, Rotem fue auxiliar de un magistrado de la Corte Suprema de Justicia de Israel. Rotem tiene un MBA de la Universidad Hebrea de Jerusalén y una maestría en Derecho de la Universidad de Harvard. Así que tengo el gusto de presentarla. Welcome, Rotem, to Colombia, even if it's virtually. And thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Hi, Sergio. Thank you so much for this kind introduction. And I'll begin by sharing the slides, so we'll have a common ground to discuss. So 1 minute. Let me share them. Okay. So hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. I want to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me to speak with you today, and to thank you all for joining us on this virtual international journey through various specialized courts around the globe, the current station being the Israeli Economic Court. For those of you who tuned in on last week's lectures, I will say in advance that you will find here a different perspective of the Israeli Economic Court than the one presented last week by the very distinguished Professor Licht. I will try to convince that in many ways the Economic Court is a great story of success. So a little bit about what we will be discussing. As you all know, one of litigation's most open professional secrets is to know thy judge. When we prepare for a hearing or draft pleadings, we pay particular attention to the judge presiding the case and try to get a better understanding of the person we are trying to convince to decide the case in favor of our client. Similarly, in order to understand litigation before the Israeli Economic Court, and also in order to do it well, it is important to know and understand the court itself. What is this court all about? Why was it viewed necessary to establish such a court in a small country as Israel, which is 55 times smaller than Colombia? You can see the comparison right here. What were the goals set out for this court? What makes it tick? What are its driving forces and mentality? Did it live up to the expectations in the 10 years since its establishment? And what does the future hold? In this talk, I will address these questions and try to provide you with a deeper understanding of the Israeli Economic Court. The Israeli Economic Court is not really a standalone independent court, but actually fairly new to economic departments. In Israel, we have 3 judicial levels. The magistrate courts at the bottom are dispersed in different cities in Israel. Then we have the district courts, which have local jurisdiction over different geographical areas across the country. And at the top, one Supreme Court. The first economic department was established in Tel Aviv District Court 10 years ago. Why Tel Aviv, you might ask? Well, that question was also raised by different figures in Israel who pushed for the court to be located in the city of Haifa in an attempt to attract more business to the north part of the country and boost its economic growth. This fight for jurisdiction alone tells us a lot about the high hopes that accompanied the forming of the Economic Court. Still, Tel Aviv was chosen as the appropriate venue because it is the business capital of Israel, with many businesses and corporations located there. It is also the home for the Israeli Securities Authority and, of course, the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange. In other words, it was the place that needed such a court the most. 8 years later, and much due to the success of the Tel Aviv Economic Court, which we'll be addressing later on, Haifa also got the court it has been longing for. The court in Haifa is only taking its first steps, and it remains to be seen if it will live up to its expectations. We will focus our discussion on the Tel Aviv Economic Court. So what is the Economic Court all about? The cases the Economic Court hears can be divided to several main categories. First, we have civil corporate law. In this area, the court handles cases such as shareholders' dispute, contents for corporate control, bondholder grievances, derivative action, etc. The court also deals with securities law litigation, including class actions, investment advisor and portfolio managers law, mutual fund law, dual listing requirements, and other relevant causes of action. It also has jurisdiction in relation to a unique law in Israel, which is the law for promotion of competition and reduction of concentration. This law was enacted due to Israel's very concentrated economic environment. The court adjudicates criminal offenses under securities law and relevant administrative law, such as petitions against decisions made by the Israeli Securities Authority. Here, in the administrative sphere, one of the main roles the court has is hearing petitions against the Securities Enforcement Committee, which decides actions that are brought before it by the Israeli Securities Authority for violations of the securities laws. In sum, the court has a say in pretty much all the fields of enforcement through civil, criminal, and administrative actions. On the other hand, the Economic Court does not handle other type of cases that would be viewed as economic or commercial cases, such as antitrust law, tax law, commercial disputes, or even the dissolution of companies, insolvency, and restructuring. Although such areas could have also benefited from a specialized court, not adjudicating these cases allowed the court to delve more deeply and specialize in the areas of law that were assigned to it, and it also ensures that the court's docket will not be overwhelmed in a way that will undercut the court's efficiency. So now that we understand what is the Economic Court, let's go back to its enactment and understand why it was founded to begin with. So one of the interesting things about the Israeli Economic Court is that a set of very specific goals and expectations, sorry, I'm going to go back to the previous slide, it jumped. So one of the interesting things about the Economic Court is that a set of very specific goals and expectations was attached to its formation. It was clear that this court should not only serve the general purpose of justice and decide disputes between the two parties before it, but rather strive to achieve certain predefined and desirable outcomes that go beyond the narrow interest of the parties to the dispute. In 2006, the Israeli Securities Authority formed a committee headed by Professor Zohar Goshen, who now teaches in Columbia Law School. The committee was tasked with the drafting of corporate governance principles that corporations will be later encouraged to adopt as a form of best practice. In its final report, the committee came up with an additional recommendation, the forming of an economic court inspired by the very admirable Delaware Court of Chancery. The committee detailed the reasons such a court is required, what it hopes to achieve through such a court, and the court's desirable characteristics. The notion leading the Goshen Committee was what it perceived as an ideal market court equilibrium for investors' protections. You can see it right here. On the one hand, the committee stressed that courts do not have the ability to examine business decisions in retrospect. First, it is unfair due to hindsight bias issues. Second, it is impractical because judges are not familiar with the company and its business as the board. Third, it can have an undesirable chilling effect on the board that in turn will hinder the company's growth and success. And fourth, it is simply not their job. The board is elected by the company's shareholders, and the judges should not replace the directors' real-time discretion with their own. It is because of these reasons that generally in pure duty of care and negligence causes of action, the court should not intervene with the board's discretion, even if it caused massive damages to the corporation. Failing and losing is part of making business. The board is allowed to fail without facing legal repercussions, so long as it acted in good faith and did not breach its duty of loyalty. This does not mean, however, that the shareholders do not have any protections from such failure or negligence. It's just that these protections will be found outside of the courtroom, within the markets themselves. The committee believed that if corporate management is negligent, then the market will be able to fix this. The management's inefficiency will be reflected in the company's financial results and in the price of the company's share, and will ultimately bring about the replacement of the failing managers and controlling shareholders. On the other hand, the markets are ill-equipped to handle breaches of duty of loyalty. The assumption is that disproportionate distributions and tunneling of the company's assets will not be punished by the products market and will not affect the company's profitability. The size of the pie will remain the same. It is just that the controlling shareholder will be able to rip off the minority shareholders of their share of the pie. Remedy is quite uncertain in the market for control as well. The oppression of the minority shareholders will not always be fully reflected in the share's price, and the controlling shareholder may resort to other means for raising capital, such as banks and bonds. There is therefore a void in investors' protection, and to fill in this void and provide investors with a complete set of protections, here comes the court. So the committee believed, you can see it here, that a good market court equilibrium, where all the functions are working properly to provide investors with the protections they need, contributes to economic growth, to a developed market, capital market, and to more dispersed ownership structures, as there will be fewer illicit incentives for control. But in order to achieve such equilibrium and such desirable economic outcomes, the committee believed that it is necessary to have a good economic court in place. A good economic court is a court that, first, understands its place and boundaries, and do not intervene with corporate decisions that do not raise duty of loyalty issues. B, equipped with professional judges with a deep understanding of the corporate securities and financial words, so that a breach of duty of loyalty can be properly identified and so that an appropriate remedy will be given. And C, there was an aspiration of the committee that was not realized in the end, that all economic matters will be adjudicated under one roof for the sake of coherency and consistency. To conclude, the main role the committee designated to the court was the role of the protector of the minority shareholders, a function that would prevent oppression and breaches of the duty of loyalty, and perhaps help to achieve a developed market and economic growth. This is a long way from the neutral traditional portrayal of the regular courts, and it seems to envision the court with a sword rather than with a pair of scales. So in 2010, Goshen Committee's recommendations became a reality as it was adopted by the legislature. When we turn to the legislature's explanatory notes, we see similar sentiments and hopes. You have the quotes before you, and you can see that the legislators speak of improving the criminal, administrative, and civil enforcement, efficient, professional, and specialized court, coherent and consistent case law, reducing uncertainty, and enhancing stability. So, what did this all mean from a litigator's point of view, which is also in many parts the client's point of view? As you can see from the table, there were some concerns. One of the main concerns from the corporate side was that a court that is entrusted with civil enforcement as opposed to a simple adjudication of civil disputes, will adopt a prosecutorial approach which will have adverse effects such as chilling effect on the director's decision-making process, on directors' willingness to serve on the board, will complicate and slow down businesses and transactions, and will eventually cause the corporation to incur substantial costs. A similar concern was that corporations will be flooded with class and derivative actions. This is more of a client's rather than a lawyer's concern, of course, if I want to be honest. And also, what happens if there is a poor quality body of case law, while the power to decide economic matters is placed for the most part in the hands of only 3 judges? Still, these concerns were outweighed by the hopes and promises that the court entailed, and the business and law communities welcomed the economic court with open arms. First, professionalism, knowledge, and understanding are key for balanced, reasoned, and good decisions. For example, at our firm, we represent clients in corporate disputes in the family courts when the relevant parties are family members or ex-spouses. The family court judges do not have the availability to specialize in corporate law, and this makes the adjudication of these disputes incredibly challenging and unpredictable. In addition, an important reassurance was that the court was not only tasked with civil enforcement and protection of minority shareholders, but also with the task of improving the capital market. The court was also warned from interfering too much with the board's discretion. It was also quite obvious that the promised efficiency and certainty that will come from the court will be extremely important and helpful to the business world. Finally, better protections for investors should enhance their trust in the capital market and willingness to invest, which will ultimately benefit the corporations as well. From the plaintiff's bar perspective, the forming of the court was fantastic news. They obviously anticipated better incentives to initiate derivative and class actions in terms of attorneys' fees, and they were also looking forward to the further development of their line of work. Up until the economic court was established, the majority of civil enforcement and class actions focused on consumers' litigation. Now, new doors were opening for them with a huge welcome sign above them. So, what happened? What's the verdict on the economic court? Well, the court got off to a pretty slow start, with one commentator writing in a very popular Israeli newspaper in 2011 that the economic court's judges have too much free time on their hands, that soon they will start knitting. However, soon enough, the court's hands were full. I was struggling to find the exact number of new cases in 2011 versus 2019, as this is a department within a court and there is unfortunately no public data about this. However, other than the fact that there is research and articles to suggest a significant rise in the number of cases, the simple fact is that the Minister of Justice saw fit to raise the maximum amount of judges in the department from 3 to 5, and in 2019 a 4th judge was already appointed to assist with the current court's case law. Now, moving forward, what about the public's opinion? By public, I mean the business world, academia, media, and lawyers. So the verdict on their part is that this is a story of success. Of course, the economic court's case law is not free from critique, but in general, the court and its judges gained much praise and acclaim in the relevant circles. As for the legislators, the verdict for the legislator is also a positive one. We can see this in the explanatory notes to the legislation that established the 2nd Economic Department in Haifa. There it was declared that the 2nd Economic Court is established in light of the successful experience of the Tel Aviv Economic Department. So what explains this general satisfaction and approval of the court? What are the different elements that comprise the court's success? When you look at the court today, 10 years after it opened after it opened its doors to the public for the very first time, you can see that it pretty much ticked all the boxes and that it generally followed the Goshen Committee's envisioned equilibrium. First, the court performs with remarkable efficiency. There is data to support this. For example, if ATA runs research, showed enhanced improvement in the duration of derivative and class actions, and concluded that the economic court deals with complex cases quicker and more efficiently than other district courts. It also showed that the economic court brings more cases to an end in early stages of the litigation via settlements or in limit decisions. And indeed, I can attest to the fact that the judges come very well informed and prepared to the hearings and drive compromises and settlements. There is also my own subjective experience, and the story of Perrigo versus Mylan NV can serve as a very illustrative anecdote. Mylan NV, a Dutch company listed on the Nasdaq, which is our firm's client, was after Perrigo, an Irish company with dual listing in the New York Stock Exchange and in the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange. Mylan made a $30 billion unsolicited offer to acquire all the issued shares of Perrigo, in what became, at least at that time, which is 2015, the largest hostile takeover offer in history to go to completion. Perrigo's management, as managements usually do, wasn't having it. It did everything in its power to prevent it. The management used the media, bleak projections, and litigation around the globe in the United States, Ireland, and Israel to prevent the takeover. In Israel, Perrigo turned to the economic court and sought an injunction that would have prevented Mylan from even making it the unsolicited offer available for Perrigo's Israeli shareholders. This was a massive, complex case that raised novel questions in securities and corporate law. It required not only a deep understanding of Israeli securities and corporate law, but also an understanding of different issues under Irish and Dutch laws. For example, the mechanism of a unique Dutch poison pill called the Stichting Fund, and aggressive articles of association rules that allowed Mylan's board of directors effective defenses against its replacement. Within a period of about 30 days, lengthy pleadings and expert opinions were filed, some of which were only submitted to the court on the night before the hearing. The hearing took place from the early hours of the morning to the late afternoon. When the hearing was adjourned, the court was left with only 24 hours to render its decision. This is because Mylan's final date for extending the offer was at the very next day following the decision. The court did not only have to produce a quick decision, but it also had to produce a good decision. It was clear that whatever the court will decide was about to determine the fate of the transaction. Any decision will be irreversible, as there was no time to appeal it. The court rose to the challenge. In 24 hours, it issued a 43 pages, well-reasoned, groundbreaking decision. The court rejected the motion for injunction, made new law, and allowed Perrigo's shareholders to make their own mind about the offer. I have no doubt in my mind that if we did not have an experienced, efficient, specialized court, the outcome would have been completely different. At the very least, the parties would not have gotten the much-needed certainty prior to the last date of making the purchase offer. Clearly, since we won, I believe the court also made the right decision. But I will also note that although Perrigo's shareholders ultimately rejected Mylan's offer, there is currently a class action in the United States in which Perrigo's shareholders sue Perrigo's former management for publishing misleading information in its fight against Mylan. Perrigo's shareholders claim that this information led them to reject Mylan's very generous offer and resulted in substantial losses for Perrigo's shareholders. So the efficiency box was clearly ticked by the economic court. Other boxes have been ticked as well. The efficiency did not come at the expense of quality. We see very well-reasoned, educated decision coming from the court, even if we disagree with some of them. There is greater consistency and coherence in the corporate case law. The three judges respected each other and made a point to be guided by their colleagues' decision. This is a very important point. The rise in the number of the economic cases brought before the court produced extended body of case law, which sends corporate professors to re-update their syllabus each and every year. All in all, these features enhanced, at least in certain more settled areas of the law, the level of certainty that corporations have. We do still have underdeveloped, even quite messy areas of the law, but I think this will be sorted out with time. Now, what happened in terms of the role of the court in the financial markets ecosystem? Well, it is apparent both from the court's rulings and from the judges' own statements in different speaking engagements they attend, that the court fully embraced the role that the Goshen Committee envisioned for it. The court and its judges perceive themselves as an important and integral part of the financial market enforcement mechanisms. Among other things, they welcome and invite class and derivative actions, believing they are key elements of robust and healthy civil enforcement. They raise the amounts of attorneys' fees awarded in class and derivative actions as an encouragement and incentives to plaintiffs' bar to bring these type of claims, and they introduced harsher sentencing in criminal cases, including actual jail time for securities fraud. On the other hand, their decisions are well balanced. They do not take a prosecutorial approach. You are not doomed if a duty of loyalty case has been brought against you. They adhere to the discretion of the board in duty of care cases by applying the business judgment rule, and they understand very well the dangers of a frightened market. In terms of the real-world market effect, it is of course difficult to say, as there are so many variables and factors that go into this equation. However, there is an interesting study by Blum and Hannes about control premiums in Israel that is worth mentioning. A control premium is the value a controlling shareholder will get above the market value of the shares for its control of the company. There are generally two explanations for the existence of a control premium. One, that it represents the legitimate added value for someone to be able to navigate the company. Two, that it represents illicit added value for the ability to basically rip off minority shareholders and to tunnel assets to the controlling shareholder at their expense. A high controlling premium rate suggests that there are greater chances that the control premium represents an illicit added value. Israel used to have an infamous high control premium rate, reaching an average of 31.4% in the years 1993 till 2005. However, Blum and Hannes' new study shows a drastic reduction on the average control premium, reaching an average of 10.1% in the years 2001 till 2019. Some of the years of the study overlap, but the clear indication is that of a substantive reduction of the premium for control. Although there are many factors who are thought to affect such a reduction, Blum and Hannes believe the economic court also deserves some of the credit for it, which is pretty nice. So this brings us to the questions of what does the future hold moving forward? Well, we are now in the midst of a significant change in the life of the economic court, a period of transition. The key to the court's success thus far was these fabulous three, who acted as judges for the economic court from its birth and brought it to where it is today. Since then, one judge retired. The number of judges who deal with economic cases more than doubled, going from 3 to 7 judges, and they now sit in 2 different venues, Tel Aviv and Haifa. This new situation raises many questions. Are 7 judges too many judges, in the sense that we now can expect inconsistency in the case law? Will the new judges rule in line with existing case law? Will they continue to promote coherence and predictability? Will they continue to be guided by each other's ruling, or will they present conflicting views that will have to await a Supreme Court's resolution? Another burning question for the near future is the effects that the COVID-19 pandemic and subsequent economic state of affairs will have on the cases and the litigation before the economic court. This is, of course, a question that I'm sure we will all deal with it around the globe. So I will finish with this. Whatever the future holds, I thought to finish with some main lessons and advice from the litigator's perspective. So one, I think there is a greater ability to advise clients pre and post litigation, and the practice can be described as high-level, relatively fast litigation, which requires high professionalism and specialization. As the court was entrusted with the role of the protector of minority shareholders, and as it was hoped that it would contribute to improving the capital market, policy concerns must be addressed in pleadings and arguments if we want to convince the judge we're standing before him, and it is also absolutely required to keep up with the ongoing stream of case law. As for the future, the most practical advice would be to watch and adapt. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Rotem, for a very thought-provoking presentation and lecture. So time really does fly, but I do want to bring to your attention a question from the audience that I think builds on a striking resemblance between Israel and Colombia. From the court structure that you explained in your lecture, it seems that you have a specialized court below in Tel Aviv and Haifa, but a generalist court above, the Supreme Court. So here's the question: does the Supreme Court often overrule the decisions that are rendered by the specialized courts? And if so, what's your perspective on this issue?
Okay, thank you. So actually, we didn't have that much of a litigation in the Supreme Court regarding the corporate world because a lot of the cases are derivative and class actions that if the economic court approves, certify, usually it comes to a settlement between the parties. But recently there have been some few interesting cases in which the Supreme Court has examined the economic court's rulings, and it pretty much followed with the footsteps of the economic court. And one prime example for it is the Vardinkov case, where the court in 2016, I think, it was the first time that the Supreme Court approved the business judgment rule. So it recognized that this was a rule that grew within the economic court, within the lower courts. And then it says, well, it's actually not a big secret that we have a business judgment rule in Israel. I think it's time to officially declare it as an instructive case law in Israel. But it will be interesting to see for the future, yeah, how it will go when more cases will reach the Supreme Court, because as you said, the judges there are not specialized judges.
Very interesting. Thank you so much, Rotem, for joining us. It was a privilege having you on this panel. Take care, and I'll send over some other questions that we've been receiving. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Muy bien, gracias, Rotem. Para este tercer y último panel de la sesión de hoy, tenemos el gusto de darle la bienvenida a dos litigantes de Delaware, que como ya varios de los conferencistas han mencionado hasta hoy, es uno de los referentes mundiales en materia de litigios societarios. Se trata de los doctores John Reed y Ronald N. Brown III. John Reed es socio del área de litigios de las oficinas de DLA Piper en Wilmington, Delaware. Cuenta con más de 20 años de experiencia litigando conflictos societarios ante la Corte de Cancillería de Delaware y la Corte Suprema de Delaware en conflictos muy prominentes que involucran temas de tomas hostiles de control, deberes fiduciarios de administradores y accionistas controlantes, litigio en materia de fusiones y adquisiciones. Cuenta con estudios con honores de la Universidad de Widener en Delaware y ha sido reconocido por Chambers and Partners por su experiencia y habilidad resolviendo conflictos societarios. Por su parte, Ronald N. Brown también es socio de la práctica de litigio societario en DLA Piper Wilmington, y también su práctica se enfoca en litigios de alto impacto, complejos en materia de fusiones y adquisiciones, tomas hostiles de control, deberes de administradores y controlantes. Cuenta con estudios con honores de la Universidad de Villanova, donde además es profesor asociado de fusiones y adquisiciones. Así que bienvenidos, John, Ronald, welcome to Columbia. Thank you very much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Okay. I'm assuming everyone can see me and hear me. I want to start.
Loud and clear, yes.
Yes, I want to start by wishing the best of health to all of you and your families and your friends. It's a tough time all of us are going through around the world, and I wish I could be doing this in person. The title of this session is Litigation Before the Delaware Court of Chancery. Now, I've practiced nearly 30 years before the Delaware courts, and I think it's very important to understand the evolution of Delaware and how it came to be so preeminent in the area of corporate formation and corporate litigation. Now, Delaware is the state of incorporation for 68% of the Fortune 500. For more than half of all U.S. public companies, which means Delaware has more public companies incorporated than all of the other 49 states combined. Last year, 89% of U.S. public offerings involved Delaware corporations. As Delaware, Delaware's maintained its dominance for decades. As the economies have gone global, Delaware has wanted to maintain its dominance for international players seeking to do business through the formation of U.S. companies. As probably most of you on this program know, in the United States, the formation of corporations and the internal governance of corporations is a matter of state law, not federal law. So if you're seeking to incorporate in the United States, you have 50 states to choose from. Delaware knows this more than anyone, and it wants to make sure that international players seek to incorporate in Delaware as opposed to one of the other 49 states. Now, to achieve this goal, Delaware regularly sends trade missions around the world to speak on Delaware law. These missions include representatives from the Delaware Secretary of State's office, Delaware judges, both Supreme Court and Chancery Court judges, and usually one or two Delaware lawyers. I was privileged to represent the state on several of those missions in places like Beijing, Taiwan, Singapore, and several European countries. On those missions, we would meet with judges, we would meet with regulatory agencies that regulate corporations and securities, and we would often give presentations to business organizations like chambers of commerce. I even had the privilege of speaking on Delaware corporate law at The Hague several years ago. Now, you may be wondering why it is I'm telling you all of this. And the reason I am is because I've discovered that many practitioners know about Delaware's preeminence in the area of corporate law, but they really don't know why or how it happened. Many people think that companies incorporate in Delaware because of taxes, but it has very little, if anything, to do with taxes. And I think you should know what drives Delaware in order to understand it. So I'm going to try to talk about that. Delaware has become the favorite state of incorporation because of predictability, speed, and a politically free litigation environment. Now, on the issue of predictability, Delaware has the most widely developed body of written opinions interpreting fiduciary duties, corporate code provisions, and other things that affect the governance of a corporation. Now, Delaware's origin on this is much more the product of luck than careful government planning. Early in the last century, the United States had a president named Woodrow Wilson. But before he became president, he was governor of one of our states, which was New Jersey. At that particular time, New Jersey dominated in the area of corporate formation. But then Governor Wilson imposed some of the strictest state antitrust laws in the country. And in protest, corporations left and simply gravitated to the state that was across the river from New Jersey, and that happened to be Delaware. Delaware didn't have anything to do with that. But over the years, those corporations and their shareholders got involved in disputes. And the next thing you know, we had more and more opinions being issued, and therefore more and more guidance on corporate law. And suddenly, Delaware had more guidance on corporate law than any other state. That guidance provided a lot of comfort to investors, and so most people started incorporating in Delaware. Things just multiplied, and it sort of got out of control like some monster on steroids. And Delaware didn't have anything to do with that. But I will tell you this, Delaware did not rest on its good fortune. And it had and it currently has a very significant financial incentive to make sure that it maintains its dominance. You may not believe this, but Delaware annually gets almost 30% of its full state budget covered by the corporate franchise tax that it collects from companies that incorporate in Delaware. So how does Delaware do it? Well, to start, it has a specialized court called the Court of Chancery that hears all corporate disputes. Delaware does not elect its judges. The Delaware judges are nominated by the governor and approved by the state senate. And it's very careful to make sure that it puts only the most sophisticated corporate practitioners on its court. Also, Delaware says, and it says this because it's true, that it moves at the speed of business. You can have a full trial in 2 to 4 months before the Court of Chancery, even if it's a multi-billion-dollar dispute. And at the end of that dispute, you will get a detailed written opinion where the judge will explain the rationale for his or her decision. We also have no intermediate appellate court in Delaware. There's a direct appeal to the Supreme Court. We have sophisticated corporate practitioners on that Supreme Court. And if necessary, that court will resolve your appeal in a matter of weeks. In other states, your case can take years sometimes to resolve. And as you know, if you want to continue to do business and you want to do a merger, for example, you can't wait 2 years. And it's just not how you just can't do business that way. And Delaware knows this, and Delaware works very, very hard to accommodate business. So that's the speed part of the Delaware court system. What about the competence in the court's decisions? And I'm not just talking about the competency in the decisions. I'm talking about the integrity in the decisions. You know, we have the competency well covered by making sure we put sophisticated folks there. And from the integrity point of view, we keep the politics out of it by not electing our judges. But there are other things that are important as well. And, you know, when I talked earlier about a lack of political influence, I wasn't just talking about the judges not being elected. You have to understand that while all of these companies are incorporated in Delaware, they're not headquartered in Delaware, and they don't have operations in Delaware. This is, in my view, very significant and often overlooked because what it means is there are no external community forces on our judicial process. None of our judges are going to a church or a social club or other places where they'll run into a CEO who might have a case in front of the court. Similarly, there are no employees in the community to exercise political influence. And there are certainly no employees in the community who, for example, if they were to lose their job in a merger, you know, they're not there to put that kind of influence on our system. So our judges operate in a very, very comfortable and independent environment, which is very difficult to replicate. We just happen to be the product of being small, and the fact that the companies aren't physically here, they just happen to be incorporated here. So that's the sort of the structural part you need to understand about Delaware as to how it maintains its dominance and why people are comfortable coming to Delaware. But this finally then brings me to the substantive area of the law. And then I'm going to talk briefly about that, and then I'm going to turn this over to my partner, Ron Brown. But there are some core themes and principles in our substantive law that make all this work, and you need to understand them. First, we have something called the Internal Affairs Doctrine. Now, under the Internal Affairs Doctrine, that means that Delaware law will apply to the internal governance of the corporation, no matter where it's doing business. So if you're incorporated in Delaware, you are governed by Delaware law. And that's important. If you are a sophisticated practitioner in the corporate area in the United States or around the world, you're probably already very familiar with Delaware law if you've had to advise clients who are Delaware corporations, because you've had to look at that law because it governs their internal governance. And that's why Delaware is so important to lawyers, not just in Delaware, but lawyers around the world. The other thing that's very important is that Delaware does its absolute best to maintain the divide between management and ownership. The equity holders get to elect the directors. They get to vote on important things like a merger or an amendment to their charter. But other than that, the board of directors and the officers run the day-to-day management of the company. Delaware has something called the business judgment rule that does not allow stockholders to interfere with that separation between ownership and management. And the business judgment rule is essentially this: if the directors satisfy their fiduciary duty of care by fully informing themselves about all material information related to a decision they're making, and if they satisfy their fiduciary duty of loyalty, meaning that they do not have a conflict of interest in the decision that they're making, the Delaware courts will not interfere and will not second guess that decision, even if with hindsight, it turns out to have been a very bad business decision. The goal of the business judgment rule is to encourage entrepreneurial risk-taking so that directors can be free to take the kind of risks that are necessary for a company to succeed without fear of personal liability from stockholders. The policy behind the business judgment rule is really quite simple, and that is the encouragement of entrepreneurial risk-taking leads to a greater maximization of shareholder value. And of course, in the long run, the maximization of shareholder value leads to a prosperous economy, and a prosperous economy benefits everybody in the community. And so, at least for now, Delaware continues to adhere to the principles of maximization of shareholder value, and that the purpose of the corporation is to produce a return for its investors. I don't think I have anything more to add about this, and we can take some questions at the end, but for now, I think it's probably best for me to now turn this over to my partner, Ron Brown, who's also here in Delaware.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you all for having us here today. Let me see if I can get our screenshot up here with our presentation. Oh. I guess we'll go with that for a moment. In any event, just building off of what John said, we are, pardon me for one moment here. Here we go. Building off what John said, Delaware is unique, at least in the context of the United States, and just going back, as John mentioned, it's really a matter of happenstance that Delaware rose to preeminence in corporate law. I thought it was interesting learning from our colleagues who presented today that the Israeli court was created within the last 10, 20 years, that the Netherlands has had a specialized court for 45 years. The Court of Chancery has been around since 1792, and for at least the first 100 years of its existence, it didn't do much of anything other than what you'd expect a traditional court of equity to do. It was land disputes, things like that. It was only really, as John mentioned, at the beginning of the turn of the 20th century when Delaware amended its constitution to allow private corporations and passed a general corporation law in 1899 that Delaware really started to have corporate litigation decided in the Court of Chancery. And as John mentioned, it was really the faux pas, if you will, of Governor Wilson in New Jersey, which led to most corporations choosing Delaware. And as from a perspective of litigation, you saw that really start to develop from sort of about the World War I era and going forward. But when it really took off and when Delaware really became known on a truly national and international level was the hostile takeover boom of the 1980s. Many of you may be familiar with the famous trilogy of Smith v. Van Gorkum, Revlon, and Unical. That hostile takeover boom, which really started at the end of the 1970s and developed into the 80s and led to those famous decisions, really put Delaware sort of on the front page of the Wall Street Journal from a perspective of litigation. And, going back even before then, there were many significant decisions coming out of the Court of Chancery and the Delaware Supreme Court, but it was that really made people take notice as to why Delaware and its court system were so important. And I think in contrast, as John mentioned, when you're incorporating in the United States, there's really no such thing as a U.S. corporation. It's really just a matter of what state do you want to incorporate in. And as a result of those decisions in Delaware, which were, I think, perceived to be stockholder friendly, takeover friendly, but appropriately balanced, other states decided to diverge, right? You saw a wave of anti-takeover statutes coming about. You saw states like Pennsylvania and Ohio adopting provisions in their code which were anti-takeover. And I think that time period really solidified and made clear that Delaware was the right jurisdiction to incorporate in. And to this day, Delaware remains on the cutting edge of corporate law and corporate litigation. Just to go over and outline what the court looks like, the Court of Chancery has 7 members. It's Chancellor Bouchard, Vice Chancellors Glasscock, Lasser, Slide, Cern, McCormick, and Fioravanti. All of these judges are experienced corporate litigators to varying degrees, and they've taken different paths to get to the court, but all of them are well known. As John mentioned, they're appointed by the governor with the assistance of a committee of Delaware lawyers and confirmed by the Senate. I think a key aspect, and this came up in a couple of the other discussions, is that there is a direct appeal from the Court of Chancery to the Delaware Supreme Court. And while the Delaware Supreme Court is a court of general jurisdiction, that is, it considers everything in Delaware, you have to keep in mind that Delaware has a population of approximately 1 million people, and it's a very small state. So not only do you have a direct appeal to the Delaware Supreme Court, the Delaware Supreme Court, all of the justices are well known for their corporate law acumen. In fact, 4 of the 5 justices were by practice corporate litigators. And I think it's also important to note just the volume of opinions that are available, not only from the Court of Chancery, but also from the Delaware Supreme Court. I referenced the trilogy of Smith v. Van Gorkum, Revlon, Unical. There are, probably 100 significant Delaware Supreme Court decisions on corporate law matters, and those are available. They're things that practitioners, both litigators and corporate attorneys, are familiar with. And again, John mentioned the absence of political influence in the Delaware judiciary. Part of that is there's actually a provision in the Delaware Constitution that there's a requirement for political balance. That is, there cannot be more than a majority of one member of any of the courts that is either Republican or Democrat. So it is a very balanced, very balanced court politically. And because Delaware is so focused on corporate law issues, a lot of the other political issues that you'd see tend to not be as prominent here as they are elsewhere. There is, I should note, some federal litigation which is challenging the constitutionality of that provision, but it's in fact that's going to the U.S. Supreme Court. One other key aspect that I wanted to mention is that from a judicial perspective, Delaware is really a total package. In addition to the Court of Chancery, which is the specialized trial court, and we'll talk about the scope of its jurisdiction, there's also a very strong court of law, the Superior Court, which itself has a complex division, and there are also very experienced federal courts, especially bankruptcy. We have a significant number of judges on our bankruptcy court and the federal district court. So you have, really a total package. If you come to Delaware, you have the famous Court of Chancery, which has direct appeals to the Delaware Supreme Court. You also have an excellent state court of law for trial. You have the ability to file and get a very experienced judge, experienced in corporate bankruptcy, and you have an experienced federal court with strong decisions in securities law as well as IP and other matters. So just talking about the type of cases that we see in the Delaware Court of Chancery, and I think if you tuned in last week, Professor Hammermesh was here and may have talked about some of these things. But the focus now is, as I mentioned, on corporate disputes. You'll still see things like disputes over a property boundary or other matters in equity, but fiduciary duty lawsuits. And you'll, as John mentioned, there's a duty of care, there's a duty of loyalty. Delaware recognizes both derivative and direct class action lawsuits. And this can really be, frankly, anything. This can be a lawsuit against directors who have, breached their fiduciary duty by being interested. This can be, Delaware also extends fiduciary duties to controlling stockholders. So this can really be anything, and this is a pretty broad category. Another thing we'll see, and this is probably the most famous, is contests for corporate control. John mentioned you can have a full trial in 2 months. You can have absolutely do that. You can have an injunction hearing in a matter of days. If there is a dispute over, competing bidders in a merger, that can be heard very promptly, and everyone knows that. There are also appraisal actions, right? Under the Delaware General Corporation Law, Section 262, if there is a cash-out merger and among other circumstances, the stockholders can petition the court to receive fair value for their shares. Another key area which we've seen a lot of expansion in recently is actions related to alternative entities. By statute, actions interpreting the rights of managers and members in LLCs or partners and limited partners in LLPs can be heard in the Delaware Court of Chancery. And the court has had occasion quite often recently to develop that case law and issue things like that. A final one I'll mention by way of example is books and records actions. So you have the ability as a stockholder of a Delaware corporation to demand books and records, to inspect the books and records of that corporation, and you have the ability to go into court in Delaware in the Court of Chancery and have that heard in 45 or 60 days and get those records if you need them. Again, as a traditional court of equity, the court has the ability to issue injunctions. You see this. You see hearings for this in contests for corporate control, but you also see it in connection with disclosure issues. In particular, one of the focuses of the plaintiffs' bar recently has been to focus on the disclosures that are provided to stockholders in context of approving things like mergers. The court also has the ability to issue declarations as to the rights of a corporation, a director or stockholder under bylaws or under the certificate of incorporation or under a stockholders agreement. And, the ability to have all of these things decided on a prompt basis, and because of the huge volume of cases that have come out of the Court of Chancery, really provides practitioners, not just Delaware practitioners, but practitioners throughout the United States and practitioners throughout the world who deal with Delaware entities, a real level of certainty, of predictability about the ability to understand it, understand what the court is likely to do, what a provision is meant to do, and how it actually is applied. Just the sheer volume of decisions. Yes, it is absolutely true that there are certain areas where the law isn't 100% developed, but in most instances, in almost all instances, there will be an answer in Delaware, and there probably won't be an answer in another jurisdiction, at least not in the United States. So talking about why Delaware has this competitive advantage, as I mentioned, there is extremely highly developed case law and a very experienced and competent judiciary. But there's also the aspect of the Delaware legislature. As I mentioned, Delaware is a very small state, right? It has approximately 1 million people in it. And the legislature really focuses on that and focuses on the fact that it is a significant portion of the budget. So annually, the Delaware legislature will examine, again, along with a committee of Delaware lawyers, examine the Delaware General Corporation Law, examine the laws governing alternative entities, and tweak the statute as necessary. The other point is there are a lot of lawyers and a lot of good lawyers who understand Delaware law. My partner John, of course, among them. But it's there's that infrastructure there. Another thing is, and this is I think key, is jurisdiction. By statute, parties to a contract can choose Delaware law, and I think that's key. You often have in this modern world international companies. You may have, for example, a company in the Netherlands and a company in Israel. Well, if they're doing a transaction, they could pick Delaware law to govern that, and they could consent to jurisdiction in the Court of Chancery and the Delaware state courts. Also, under Delaware statutes, directors of a Delaware corporation are subject to the jurisdiction of the Delaware courts. The court is very permissive in allowing the courts to exercise jurisdiction if the parties agree to it. And then there's the additional level of statutes which provide for the exclusive jurisdiction of the Court of Chancery to resolve certain disputes, things like books and records actions, appraisal actions, things like that. And again, this is Delaware is not a place where traditionally companies actually operate. It's one where they incorporate. But you'll see this concept of Delaware forum selection provisions, right? Either internationally or among states. If you have you have the ability for in an agreement to select that any dispute will be resolved in Delaware. These are nearly universally recognized by their courts, at least within the United States, and it avoids a problem of having one party sue in one state and another party sue in another state, or stockholders suing in multiple states and multiple courts. So I think there's a few lessons we can take away. I know our audience is focused on Columbia, but I think there's a few lessons that we can take from Delaware and apply. So as John mentioned, I think he said 68% of the Fortune 500 are in Delaware. It remains the choice of incorporation in most industries. But as I mentioned, the law is constantly being, I wouldn't say revised, I would say tweaked and maintained by the Delaware legislature. That's a difficult thing to do. Typically, legislative bodies have a lot of things that they're focused on because they're either national or involved in a large state. Delaware, by being so small, has the ability to keep that up to date. And as we've heard about them today, other jurisdictions have courts that try to emulate the Delaware Court of Chancery and Delaware Judiciary, and I think a number of them have been very successful. But at least in the United States, and the ones that I'm experienced with, because, and it's almost a recursive loop, because Delaware has so many corporations, has so much law to begin with, it's harder to get a critical mass of cases, harder to get the appropriate folks to serve on the court, harder to have a court, a court of appeal that would be as familiar with corporate law. So you can copy Delaware's case law. You can copy the having a specialized court, but for that court to be successful, you also have to have the infrastructure, as I like to call it, the lawyers, the decisions, the familiarity to replicate it. And again, consistency, and I don't think John or I can say this too much, consistency and predictability in decisions are key to Delaware's success. So for example, if I am, asked a question by a client with regard to a particular statute in Delaware or a particular provision in a certificate of incorporation or bylaw, I will be able to, because of the volume of case law and the volume of decisions in Delaware, and frankly also because of the familiarity that a lot of attorneys have with Delaware, be able to give consistent advice and predictable advice as to the meaning of that provision. And that is something that I think doesn't exist in a lot of jurisdictions. So because the Delaware courts are consistent, they're, sure, there may be a case that's decided one way in the Court of Chancery and gets appealed to the Delaware Supreme Court and is overturned. That happens. But for the most part, except at the margins, Delaware and how a court would decide something is quite predictable. And again, this concept that John talked about and did a much more eloquent job than I ever could about the absence of political influence, not just in the traditional sense of, a party or of a position, but also in sort of the ground level, right? A decision by a vice chancellor to permit a hostile takeover to go through that results in job loss, is not likely to come back and meet that vice chancellor, in the line to drop his kids off at school. So I think, all of these factors together combined really lead to Delaware's preeminence in corporate law and also in the context of litigation and complex dispute resolution. With that, I'll ask for any questions for John or I, but there is our presentation.
Thank you so much, John and Ron, for your very interesting remarks. So let's open the floor for questions for the remaining minutes of our conference. And let me start with the following question. John, you mentioned that Delaware currently ascribes to a principle whereby companies should be managed for the benefit of shareholders and maximizing their value, the value of their shares. However, exactly a year ago today, the Business Roundtable issued what some have called a groundbreaking statement where CEOs of some of the biggest Delaware companies committed to managing their business for the benefit of stakeholder interests, including employees, customers, the environment, etc. So do you foresee Delaware law moving towards a more stakeholderist model? And if so, how do you think that would impact shareholder litigation and corporate litigation in general?
So Delaware actually passed a section of its corporate code that allows a company to incorporate as a constituency corporation, which allows them to take into consideration interests other than simply the maximization of shareholder value for the owners. Most of the folks who participate in those positions and so forth haven't asked their corporations to be converted over to that form. But even without that form, the maximization of shareholder value casts a very wide net. the promotion of your workforce, the promotion of the environment, donating money to local museums and other things are things that promote the goodwill of the corporation and therefore maximize the shareholder value of the corporation. So it is not like you have a situation where the goal is just to make as much money as possible with a total disregard for everything, because that's just not a goal that anybody agrees with. The taking into consideration some of these other constituencies promotes the value of the company. The difference is the only people that should be allowed to come in and have a say in what the corporation does is the owners. You wouldn't allow an environmental group, for example, to come in and challenge a decision by the board to open up a particular plant in an area that they thought might not have been environmentally sound. Those there are other laws if they want to do those kinds of things, but you don't allow constituencies other than the stockholders to have a say in any aspect of the management, and that's the difference.
Thank you, John. Here's a question, I'm sure, from a litigator related to rules on evidence. This person asks if discovery, in your opinion, has had an impact on corporate dispute resolution and prevention in Delaware. Again, does discovery have an impact on corporate dispute resolution?
I'm going to let Ron take this in a second, but I want to make a comment on this. One of the biggest fears that people outside the United States have is litigation in the United States, because litigation has become so expensive. And with things like electronic discovery, it has become, just an overbearing and unpleasant experience for people involved in litigation. And has it made a difference on our substantive law or the outcomes in cases? I don't really think so, but it has made the cases much more difficult to litigate, and in often cases very unpleasant. For example, it only takes a situation where a CEO, loses his phone or his laptop, and suddenly the other side's claiming that all the secret deals were on those emails that are lost or on that phone that was lost. It becomes a very, very complicated and unpleasant situation. I'll let Ron add to what I just said.
Yeah, certainly, John, I agree with everything that you have said thus far. I will note that the availability of discovery, especially from the perspective of the plaintiff's bar, does two things. One, it gives them leverage because of the cost of it. It also provides the opportunity to find the quote-unquote smoking gun email. And while that is rare in practice, there have been a number of opinions where the existence of documents that called into question the credibility of a witness or provided something and that was a basis to have a claim to exist in Delaware. And I know both, from practicing internationally, or at least understanding some of the international court systems, that the level of discovery in the United States is much higher. Where that balance is between an appropriate amount of discovery and what I think we have now, where there is perhaps a little too much discovery, I don't really know.
Interesting. Thank you, Ron. Thank you, John. And kind of related to what you just said, Ron, I have a question here related to settlements. One of you mentioned that there's a large subset of cases that are actually settled and that don't go to full-fledged trial. And the question is, what factors in your experience and opinion have led to this trend in settlements?
Well, I think it depends on the type of case. There's certain cases that just by their very nature are not settlable. But one thing in Delaware is you do see the ability of a stockholder who owns 1 or 100 shares to bring a claim. So there are a number of what I would consider strike suit settlements. But I do think one key aspect of it is because of the volume of case law, because of the predictability. If you have a situation where it does need to be settled, you can advise your client as to what the likely outcomes are, what the likelihood of a decision in your favor is, and appropriately weigh those settlements. So in a lot of ways, I think that really increases the efficiency. I know from the perspective of, as a primarily a defense lawyer, If I'm in a jurisdiction in front of a judge who's seen one corporate case in his or her 20-year history, I'm going to put a bigger risk factor on that than if I'm in the Court of Chancery.
Thank you, Ron. And one last question. Someone asks if you've mentioned a lot of litigation involving public corporations. Someone in our audience asks, how often are closed corporation disputes litigated before the Court of Chancery?
Go ahead, John.
Well, let me comment on that briefly. Frequently, as a matter of fact, particularly in the area of alternative entity law with limited liability companies, you see a lot more of it. And what you need to understand is, whether the company is a closed corporation or a public corporation, the same fiduciary duties will apply, the same rules apply. I often get questions from people saying, "Well, this is not a public corporation. The rules have to be different on what I can do as a director." And the answer is, no, they are not. All the same rules apply.
I couldn't have said it better myself, John.
Well, John, Ron, thank you so much for your time. This has been really thought-provoking. We hope to have you again on the future, and please take care. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Gracias a John y a Ron por su participación. Con esto entonces damos por concluida esta tercera sesión de la jornada de conferencias sobre litigio societario. La próxima semana, el miércoles, el 26 de agosto, tendremos la tercera y última sesión de estas jornadas, en las que los doctores Néstor Humberto Martínez y Francisco Reyes van a abrir el camino para una discusión en la que algunos profesores universitarios y practicantes traeremos ideas sobre la mesa en relación con aspectos del régimen de litigio societario en Colombia que ameritan ser revisados y eventualmente reformados. Así que gracias por conectarse hoy. Esperamos que esta conferencia haya satisfecho sus expectativas y los esperamos la próxima semana para la tercera y última sesión de esta jornada. Muchas gracias.